Good morning, everybody. It's a real pleasure to hold that event, one more webinar, this time in partnership with the European Union delegation in Brazil and with SEBRI. And it's a special pleasure to have here with me my old friend, an excellent diplomat, José Alfredo Graça Lima, who will help me moderate this debate. Everybody knows the topic. The topic is very opportune, and it's in the form of a question. Is this time be different? Will the European Union manage to provide a joint response to the crisis in the wake of COVID-19 pandemic? And to address this very opportune topic, we have a wonderful, excellent guest speaker here, who is Dan O'Brien. I will allow myself to read his short bio, not to make sure that I don't make any kind of mistake. Dan O'Brien is Chief Economist at the Institute of International and European Affairs, Ireland's leading foreign affairs think tank. He's also Adjunct Senior Research Fellow at the School of Politics and International Relations at University College Dublin, and a columnist and economics analyst for Ireland's largest media organization, Independent Newspaper Group. Having said that, and once again, thank you, Dan, for making the time to be here with us. Thank you once again, Ambassador Ybáñez, the Chief Ambassador representative of the European Union here in Brazil. Very glad to have you here with us today. I'll give the floor to José Alfredo Graça Lima for a brief introduction. Then we will proceed as following. Ambassador, after Graça Lima talks, Ambassador Ybáñez will say a few words, and then we'll give the floor to Dan for a 20-minute presentation. After Dan concludes his presentation, we will open a Q&A session, and I hope everybody who is attending us will have the opportunity to ask the questions. Well, without much ado, I'll turn the mic to you, my old friend, Ambassador José Alfredo Graça Lima.
Thank you very much, Sergio. I'm delighted to be here with you to participate in this webinar. Together with Ambassador Ybáñez and Dan O'Brien. I had prepared a small presentation of the speakers myself, but you have already took care of that part. So I just make a few remarks about and perhaps also a few questions about the state of the art regarding challenges that the European Union is facing right now. For instance, I have been informed, like everyone else maybe, that Boris Johnson agreed to try to reach a trade deal by the end of the year. I think this is the first time that a possible breakthrough is in view, because negotiations have been at an impasse up to now. During the pandemic, it seems that both sides have agreed to intensify talks in July and August. It remains to be seen whether, and perhaps the speakers could comment on that, it remains to be seen whether there will be what the result of these negotiations, what it will represent in terms of the agreement that can be reached between the United Kingdom and the European Union. Whether it will be a more deep or a deep integration, not as before, but as deep as it can possibly be, or a shallow, kind of a light agreement that would only allow the flows to continue, but not in an integrated basis. The other thing that occurs to me, of course, is the possibility that the pandemics and the policies that might be adopted to encourage recovery, whether they could affect the process of review by European authorities of the bi-regional agreement, United European Union in Mercosur. There are other factors that can play a role in this process, but I'm sure Ambassador Ybáñez has for sure already expressed his insights, but if he could care to share with us some recent information, that would be very welcome, of course. And finally, let me ask whether or how Dan and Ignacio consider the impact of the multiple crises on the European Union itself. I mean, on the cohesion of the group, on the expectations for the future, looking, of course, to strengthen, for instance, looking, for instance, to a strengthened multilateral trading system. I know that Phil Hogan is urging members of the WTO to take action and to take action promptly in order to overcome a number of difficulties that have arisen. If they care to comment on that as well, I think our program would be very much enhanced. Again, let me thank you, Sergio, for the initiative on behalf of SEBRI, on behalf of President Giuseppe Borges and our council, thank you, of course, to our speakers, and looking forward to a very fruitful and interesting debate.
Thank you, José Alfredo. Now, Ambassador Ignacio, it's your turn, but before you start, let me just mention that we have here, and it's my great pleasure to have you, Barry Tamoti, General Counsel of Ireland, who is here with us today, and is among those who made this event possible. Thank you so much, Barry, for all your efforts to enhance the partnership between the Consulate General in São Paulo and many other think tanks, including Fernando Henrique Cardoso Foundation. Thank you so much. Having said that, Ambassador Ignacio, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sergio. It's really a great pleasure to participate in this event organized by so prestigious institutions like Fundação Fernando Henrique Cardoso. Thank you very much, Sergio. Of course, also SEBRI, with today with having the honor to share the participation all with Ambassador Graça Lima, and of course my colleague, the General Consul of Ireland in São Paulo, to discuss today an important issue, which is how the European Union responds in front of the crisis of the coronavirus. I must say that I'm very happy to be, I would say, the opening act of Dan O'Brien today, and to be able to present a little bit what the European Union is doing And perhaps I will be leaving some of the questions that Ambassador Graça Lima has put it in front of us for the turn of the question, because all the questions he asked, they were very pertinent. As you know, probably some of you, this event was in fact planned as part of the EU European Day, or European Month, as we say here in May, with our colleagues from the Consulate General in Sao Paulo of Ireland, and it was going to be an on-site event. And it was also, it would have been an excellent opportunity to welcome Dan O'Brien, who knows so well this country, but to have him here once again. Unfortunately, COVID was the reason why this was not able to do. But I think one of the good things of this transformation, I would say this speedy transformation that we have to do and move to the digital time allows us to have Dan today with us through this system. I think it's also a good demonstration of what and how coronavirus, COVID-19 has really changed our lives. I think from all the points of view, we have had to cancel meetings like or visits like the one of Dan, but also the COVID has really been a test for, in the case of the European Union, to our healthcare and our welfare system. It has really changed the life of the people, and this change of the life of the people have also had very strong consequences on the economic side. I mean, and when we look at the figures that are in front of us, they are really quite scarce, because we see the possibility already in this year of the reduction of our wealth, of course, of the trade between the different countries. It's going to be really a very difficult time. It is already a very difficult time, but it's going to be a very difficult time for all of us. Because of that, I mean, the European Union, and particularly the European Commission, has really tried to face this situation, and they have very recently issued a communication, which I think is going to be an important communication from the European Union. The title of the communication is Europe's Moment: Repair and Prepare for the Next Generation. So you have there the main elements. And when the President of the European Commission presented this communication in front of the European Parliament, she says, and I quote, "Now is the time for our European Union to get back to its feet and move forward together to repair damage from the crisis and prepare a better future for the next generation." This is the ambition of the European Commission. In the communication, there are important elements I would like to stress, of course, doing it quite quickly. First of all, there is something which is a novelty in our system. There is a recovery instrument. The second element is how this recovery instrument is going to base in the main policies of the European Union, particularly the Green Deal, but also the digital transformation, and also because of the effect that the crisis is having, really to move ahead on a fair and inclusive recovery. It is also the efforts of the Commission is really trying to building a more resilient union and really put again in operation the single market of the European Union, and also an aspiration, which is also one of the aspirations of this new Commission, to have a stronger Europe in the world. We will start with the recovery instrument. The recovery instrument is something which is new. I mean, we say for the size of the instrument is an important one. It will be 750 billion euro on the recovery instrument itself. And if we put this together with the EU budget, the amount for the period 2021-2027, which is the time of the financial perspective, is going to be 1,100 billion euros. Really, the novelty, and I'm sure Dan will be explaining this with more detail, is how the money is going to be raised. The money I would say, it's not the first time, but in a different way, I would say the EU is going, the European Commission is going to go to the markets to get funds from the markets, supported, of course, on the good rating that the European Commission has. And the idea is that the Commission will be investing this money that they will be getting either through grants, 500 billion through grants, 250 billion in loans to the member states. The first pillar is going to be to support the member states for investment and reform, so the member states themselves. The second pillar is about supporting the economy, incentivizing private investment. And the third pillar, which of course is important and very particularly for countries like Brazil, is from one side to reinforce our EU for Health. It's a new program that the Commission is going to present, but also to better support our global partners, because one of the lessons that we have learned is that in this crisis, we are not going to go out of the crisis alone. We have, and we need, that everybody around the world, and particularly our partners, goes out of this. What are the bases of these programs? Well, important element is that we are in a storm, but we don't want to change our direction. The direction has to be the same that it was before the storm. One of the priorities, as you know, of the new Commission was the Green Deal, and the Green Deal is going to be part of this Recovery Act. So the recovery, the idea of really to making all the public investment that are going to be done by the European Commission and the member states has to really respect what we call the Green Oath, which is to do not harm, really to respect and to promote, of course, the respect of the environment and the necessity we have to make this change. This, of course, is very much connected with the compromise that the European Union has with the Paris Accord, with the Sustainable Development Goals. All these elements are essential. The second element is a more digital single market. This we have seen in the crisis, how useful the digital transformation of our economies or our lives, I would say, is there, and we will have to push. And the idea of the European Commission is really to move that, to invest in more and better connectivity, to go for a stronger industrial and technological presence, really move to a real data economy. These are elements that, of course, we want to move. And the third element, which is very important, especially after the crisis, with a crisis which is going to affect in different ways, different countries inside the European Union, but also different sectors. The idea of the European Commission is really to have a fair and inclusive recovery. We want to support people to stay in work. This is one of their priorities. The crisis is going to affect a lot of citizens who will be losing their jobs, and we have to support these people to be staying in the work, creating new jobs whenever it is necessary, and of course reorienting our economy in this direction. The second element is, of course, to support our companies to keep and to stay in the market. This is important. And last but not least, to promote territorial cohesion, which is, of course, a very important element in the EU project. This has to be done at the same time of building a more resilient union and single market. We have seen in the crisis how dependent we are, which is, of course, I would say an element which can be positive, but it has to be very clear that we want to support. And one of the question of Ambassador Graça Lima related with the UK has, I think, also some connection with that. The single market has been a great success, I would say, for all the members of the European Union, including the UK, who were until very recently part of that, and now they see that if they lose this participation in single market, they are going to have more difficulties. So from our side, from the side of the European Union and the countries which are still in the European Union, of course, we'll be more than happy to have a close and fruitful collaboration with the UK, but now it's true in a new position. Of course, this recovery has to be based in values. This is quite important for the European Commission, I would say for the member states. Because of the crisis of the COVID, we have had to adopt some measures which I would say are going in the direction of more controls. It is understandable because we needed to have a better possibility of follow up the disease to try to eliminate the contagions. But what we have to go is to a normality where the freedoms are respected by all the member states, and this element is very important. And the last element, and with this I will finish, is of course the importance that the European Union says for the presence and the way that the European Union is going to have in the world. We have seen that we are in a globalized world from the positive sides before COVID. I would say also with the negative side on the fact that anything which is happening, even it starts in China, it goes very quickly to the rest of the world. So the exit of the crisis has to be together. And for that, we have, and the European Union really trusts on the multilateral system, we have to reinforce the rules that we have established among ourselves. We need a world which is based on rules which are respected. We need to engage with our main partners, with the US, with China, with Latin America, with all the countries, to put ahead the multilateral agenda, and this is really one element. To combat COVID itself, it's an international effort is needed, but I would say also to recover from COVID, this international effort is more than needed. So thank you very much for inviting me to participate. And as I said, some of the questions that Ambassador Gracia Lima, particularly on EU, Mercosur, I would be more than happy to answer. But now I really am looking forward to hear Dan O'Brien, who is really the center of this presentation. Thank you very much, Sergio.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Everybody is anxious to hear from you. Dan, let me just make one request. And ask, the request is the following, Ambassador Ybáñez. Since we do a summary of the discussion and we put it on demand on our website, if you can share the notes, your notes, that would add value to the summary. You can send them to me afterwards. The other request is to the people who are attending us. If you want to ask questions, please do it in a concise form in English through the Q&A at the bottom of the screen, or through the Facebook. Somehow the questions would come to my cell phone, and I will try to present as many as I can to the participants. Then now the floor is yours for about 20-25 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Sergio, and good afternoon from Ireland, and good morning to everyone there in Brazil. It's a great pleasure and an honor to join you today. Thanks to the Foundation, to SEBRI, and to our diplomatic colleagues there. Very sorry not to be able to join in person. As you know, I'm a frequent visitor to your wonderful country, and it's always a pleasure to visit, and looking forward to doing so when it's safe. We truly are living in historic weeks at the moment. Our lives have changed. The way we live our daily lives have changed for many of us. Hundreds of thousands of people have lost their lives around the world, including in your region and in this region here. And as the ambassador said in his remarks, these are frightening times economically. I have been watching how economies have developed for a quarter of a century professionally, and I have never seen anything like this. We live in a fragile world, and when we have a shock of this kind, it's very difficult to predict how things can evolve. But I think we're facing the entire world is facing a very, very difficult period from both a health perspective and also from an economic perspective. So difficult times ahead. Very great uncertainty as well. So in making any assessment of either how a country has done, or in this case, how the European Union has performed, any assessment has to be very tentative. We really don't know how things will evolve, as I say, either from a health or from an economic perspective, and how bad everything could get. So very tentative conclusions at this juncture. The focus today is on the European Union. Let me look at it from three different perspectives. Look at the role of the European Commission to date, of the European Central Bank, and of the European leaders acting collectively, European Prime Ministers, Presidents, and Finance Ministers. So look at the European Union from those three perspectives. Before doing that, I'd like to make four general points of relevance about the European Union. The first point is that health is not an EU competence. Healthcare in Europe is something, public healthcare is done at national or regional level in Europe, depending on the country. And of course, private healthcare is another matter entirely. So the EU really doesn't have that much involvement in healthcare. And I think that's always important to remember when we evaluate the role of the EU in the crisis. A second general point about the European Union it was not built for speed. The European Union is a slow problem-solving mechanism. It does things like regulate product standards from cars and computers to pharmaceuticals. It creates regulations for environmental protection. These are technocratic functions that necessarily happen slowly. And the EU is a regulatory superpower. It doesn't do what other states do. It's not a big redistributor of wealth. It doesn't have a very important role in the area of providing security. So the focus of the EU is very much on regulation. That tends to be slow, and that has meant that when the European Union has had to deal with crises in the past, it has often not been very good or slow to deal with them. 10 years ago, we had the Euro crisis, which lasted 30 months. Half a decade ago, we had a crisis in relation to large number of migrants coming into Europe because of instability in areas close to Europe. And again, that caused divisions. So crisis management can often be something the EU has difficulty dealing with. And we'll see aspects of that in a moment in relation to the virus, the pandemic. A third point is that the scale of this, from both a health and an economic perspective, has caused strains for all sorts of political organizations. A crisis causes difficulties and strains. And here in Europe, we've seen that everywhere, but we've also seen it in countries where there are internal differences. I talk particularly about Spain and the United Kingdom, where Catalonia and Scotland, there is a desire amongst some people in those regions to become independent. And this crisis, I think, has added to momentum in both of those countries. And that brings me to a wider point about legitimacy. And the European Union has a problem with legitimacy. I've been involved with the European Union in one way or the other for many years. And we constantly hear a debate in Europe about how Europe can be brought closer to the people. This is a long discussion that we've had. As I mentioned earlier, the EU is quite a technocratic entity by its nature. In most countries, that means that we don't see the European Parliament on TV. We see the national parliament. So people's focus is still on the national debate, and attempting to create a closer European discussion and debate shared by everyone has not proved as successful as people like me who support integration would like. That's very difficult. Language is one problem. But it also means that in a time of crisis, the people can feel that the European Union has let them down. And I think that is something particularly of relevance in Southern Europe, and maybe I'll come back to that more specifically later on. So to look first at the European Commission, I think the role of the Commission so far has been the easiest to assess because it doesn't have great role in healthcare. It hasn't had a very big role in the crisis. It's had some coordinating role, of course, and as the ambassador said earlier, it's made a proposal in terms of expanding the European budget. But the two most important things the European Commission has done in the crisis has been to suspend the rules that govern spending by governments, the budgetary rules. Those exist to ensure that governments don't spend too much, that there is fiscal responsibility. Those rules have been suspended because of the seriousness of the crisis, and governments are now are not being constrained in the amount they can borrow and spend, and that's appropriate in an emergency situation like this. The European Commission also quickly suspended its rules on state aid. So we have very strong rules in Europe on governments giving taxpayers money to private companies, so that to prevent unfair competition. But again, in an emergency, in a crisis, it becomes necessary for governments to support businesses so that businesses and jobs are preserved. And that is an important part of the emergency response. So the Commission has suspended two important aspects of its the wider rule book. And it did that early on, and that was, I think, the correct thing to do in the circumstances. Let's look at the European Central Bank. Now, the European Central Bank has been the most important EU institution in dealing with the crisis. In recent years, starting with Japan almost 20 years ago and other OECD countries at the time of the financial crisis 10, 12 years ago, the role of central banks became more important in stabilizing economies. Effectively, this is printing money. We call it quantitative easing, but effectively and somewhat simplistically, it involves printing money. Now, I don't think this is a general audience rather than an economic audience, so I won't go into the detail. I'm very happy to discuss, to take questions on it, but effectively, the role of money printing has become more important for OECD central banks in recent times, and particularly during the crisis. In the first weeks of the pandemic, the European Central Bank did not respond well. A number of statements were made by leading figures of the European Central Bank to suggest that it would not stabilize financial markets. And that contributed to a sense of panic in early March and a fear that the weakest country, and the weakest country at this time is Italy economically, and it was also the country to be first hit very seriously by the pandemic. So there was the beginning of a financial crisis which the ECB actually contributed to rather than calmed. Now that changed in the middle of March when a much more coherent approach was taken by the European Central Bank, and it made it very clear that it would behave like other central banks in the crisis, like the US Central Bank, the British Central Bank, the Swiss Central Bank, and that had the effect of calming financial markets. That meant that we didn't have a re-emergence of the Eurozone crisis from 2010 to 2012, and that that governments have been able to borrow money at low interest rates to address the crisis. Now, this is not a simple answer. You know, we all know money printing. If money printing was how countries became rich, there would be no poor country in the world. So it's not ideal. It comes with risks. But in this emergency situation, it is the least risky option. And since the middle of March, that is exactly what the European Central Bank has done, and it has signaled that it will continue to do that until next year at least. And that is the correct course of action in my view. So the European Central Bank, after a bad start, has done the right thing and has performed well. Let me finally go to the members acting together. And as always in Europe, really the most important thing is prime ministers and presidents, the decisions they make collectively at the European Council. When the pandemic emerged really became an emergency in the first half of March, there was the old division between North and South Europe re-emerged very quickly and very passionately. And if anyone was watching the discussions from Europe at that time, politicians publicly said some things that were very harsh towards each other. And that, I think, illustrated the depth of feeling that there was. And generally, in Southern Europe, there was a feeling that if we are in a political and economic union together, then there should be more solidarity. And Northern Europeans felt that they would not be forced into a big increase in European integration that would cost them a lot of money. So there were very strong feelings on both sides, and this resulted in many, many meetings of finance ministers and prime ministers in the early weeks of the pandemic, where they spent many hours over days arguing about corona bombs. the idea that they would collectively issue debt, EU debt. And this became a really intense debate, and I think it damaged the European Union for people to see their leaders fighting and arguing for many hours during an emergency situation where people were dying looked very bad for the European Union. And I think it's certainly in Italy in particular, where public opinion has gone from being very strongly pro-EU 20 years ago, over time has become much more Eurosceptic. And I certainly know from my friends in Italy that the early weeks of the pandemic caused a lot of anger towards the European Union and further eroded the view of the European Union in Italy. So the debate on Corona bonds continued for quite a while, and then something very big changed. Germany's position in the middle of May shifted. Germany had been the center of the northern European countries which did not want to create what's called a transfer union, where money would go from one region, from one country to other countries. But in the middle of May, Germany joined France and made a historic shift in its position on that. Germany and France together proposed that the European Commission would be given the power to borrow 500 billion euro. Now that's about 5% of all of the government debt currently outstanding in the European Union. Now that's, as you can see, 5% of existing public debt is not a huge amount, but it's certainly a very significant development, in particular for Germany, which is the biggest, the most powerful, the most influential of the EU 27 countries. And it does mark a shift. Some people have described that moment as similar to the moment in the history of the United States when the debt of the states was brought together. Alexander Hamilton, some people have called it a Hamiltonian moment in European affairs. I think that's an exaggeration. And one reason it's an exaggeration is because it hasn't been agreed yet. And we can't be sure whether it will be agreed. There are still many, many questions about this. If it goes ahead and the European Commission does borrow hundreds of billions of euro, will it be distributed in the form of grants, or will it come as loans? What sort of conditions will the governments who receive the money have to live by? How will the money be used? Will the European Commission and the leaders decide it can only be used, for example, for to reduce emissions? So there must be a very strong environmental dimension to it. Which countries will get the most money? And which countries will get less money? When will it be distributed? Over what time frame? If it's not front-loaded, the risk is that it won't help the recovery out of this very deep crisis. How and who will repay the money? Again, likely to be one of the most contentious issues. Is this time different? Very early to say. I think on the basis of past history of Europe that we don't respond well to crisis. It often takes us longer to deal with them than we should. But on the basis of past evidence, Europe usually does muddle through. And we come to a solution. Often it's not the best solution. It's not the quickest solution. But I think it would be wrong to understate the importance of European integration for the European political class, particularly in Germany. As we've seen, there was an understanding something big would have to change, and we have seen that in Germany exactly 1 month ago when they changed position on debt issuance by the European Commission. So don't underestimate Europe is maybe where I'd finish. Many other issues, as was discussed. We've got Brexit, relations with Mercosur and the trade agreement, security issues in our own region, in the Middle East and North Africa, Turkey, Russia, Brexit, relations with the United States. A lot of challenges for Europe, which will all likely be made more difficult by a very severe economic crisis. But as I say, it's always been wrong to bet against Europe. So my sense is that we will find a solution. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan. We will now start the Q&A session, and I will ask the first question. It is connected to the one that was sent to us by Norberto Valdrich, and his question is about the interplay between the complexities of the European Union, the challenges that lie ahead, that require a lot of joint action among different European countries. And this is on the one side, and on the other side, nationalistic trends prevailing at the national level. How do you see this interplay between let's say two opposing trends, nationalistic at the national level, and more, let's put it that way, federalist at the European level? And how do you see countries splitting down the road with regards to the pending issues and the fine print and the implementation of the recovery fund?
Very good question. So let's draw a distinction in Europe between public opinion and what might be called elite opinion amongst the political class. Just starting with political opinion, when Brexit happened 4 years ago, many people were concerned that it would lead to the breakup. Other countries would do the same, that other countries would see Britain leaving the European Union and saying, oh, maybe they were right to leave, and that it would strengthen the forces of Euroscepticism in Europe. Now, there clearly are Eurosceptic forces within the political systems of most countries, but it certainly hasn't led to a domino effect. And as I mentioned with Germany, the commitment to the European integration remains very, very strong. So at political level, it seems to me that there is a very strong desire to remain within the European Union and for the European Union to be a success. And that's even true if you look at some of the countries, Hungary and Poland, which are having political disagreements with, let's say, the federal center and with some other member states, that Poland and Hungary are not talking about leaving the European Union. Now, let's look at public opinion, and that's different, and it differs in different countries. I mentioned Italy in particular. I lived in Italy in the 1990s, and back then there was really no discussion about Italy. Everyone was pro-integration, and that has changed a lot. So, and no country in Europe has moved towards Euroscepticism at a public opinion level quite like Italy, and there are many, many reasons for that. And that raises questions as to how that manifests electorally, and is it possible in the future that a government in Italy or another country would be elected that did advocate leaving the European Union because it simply wins most votes. So where public opinion will shift around this crisis, again, is very uncertain. Given the depths of the crisis that we're probably going to face, I think all political structures will come under strain. There will be more criticism if we go through a very difficult economic period of high unemployment. Then I think there is likely to be an increase in Euroscepticism amongst the public, which will make finding solutions more difficult.
All right. Second question was asked by Otávio de Barros, an economist from São Paulo, and his question relates to whether nationalistic, protectionist policies will tend to arise in certain countries of the European Union as a response to the crisis, and whether this nationwide policies will tend to prevail over a more coordinated effort and might end up undermining the European Union response to the crisis, and whether do you think what are the right way to go?
Okay, another good question. I think on protectionism, certainly there has been a protectionist reaction. We've even seen that within Europe, where borders have been closed, something that would have been unthinkable 6 months ago, where borders between EU countries have been closed for health reasons. More widely, the term strategic autonomy has been used more and more in Europe recently. Maybe there's some good reasons for that. We've seen around healthcare products that there was a shortage of some of these products. In hindsight, was it wise to import so much of those healthcare products, or at least in the future, is the way to deal with that to have strategic reserves of healthcare products so that there aren't shortages in times of crisis? And personally, I think it would be better to look at strategic reserves, at additional capacity, rather than becoming more protectionist, because once the European Union, which has been an advocate of more free trade internationally, once the European Union becomes more protectionist, it seems to me that other countries will also become more protectionist. And if we all move in that direction, we will break down the efficiency gains of the global economy that have been created by a globalized economy, and everyone will lose because of that. Internally, within Europe, the suspension of state aid rules, if that goes on for a longer period of time, then that will inevitably have differences for fair competition within the EU. And that will not be good it won't be good from an economic perspective, because it will reduce competition, and it won't be good from a political perspective, because it will increase feelings in some countries that other countries are behaving unfairly and giving their companies an advantage. And that has the possibility of increasing those nationalistic kind of pressures. So I think there's a risk of a descent, a spiraling descent into protectionism, both globally and even within the European Union, as we go through this. And it's something I think we need to be very mindful of and watchful of, so that we prevent that. As the ambassador said, the single market has been a huge success for Europe, and we need to protect those things that we've been successful at.
Now I will abuse my prerogative of the moderation of the moderator, and I will ask a question of my own. And the question is, what has caused Germany to shift its position? And what kind of impact will that shift have on the so-called frugal countries? Because Germany is one of the engines of the European Union. It has a lot of leverage within the bloc. Will Germany prove to have enough weight to change the mindset among the frugal four, or not? This is another way to ask the same question. What are the chances of the recovery fund prevailing at the end of the day? And what kind of rules? Okay, yeah. So I think in Germany's case, there was an understanding of how serious this situation is. This is an emergency. The economic crisis is
already worse than during the great financial crisis of 12 years ago. It could get much worse. It really is frightening to look at how the economy here in Europe has been affected by this in most countries. It is quite unprecedented. And those disagreements, very public disagreements that happened in March and into April with European leaders and amongst European finance ministers, were very serious. You know, it's very, very unusual in Europe for leaders to criticize each other with such strong language publicly. That is just something we are not used to here in Europe. And I think amongst the German political class, there was an understanding that not doing something and not being seen to shift on this did put Germany's position in Europe at risk. And the importance of integration for the German political class is very difficult to exaggerate. You know, it is such a central part of the way German thinkers view their place in the world. So I think the gravity of the situation for Europe became clear in Germany, and they felt they needed to do something significant. And of course, France had long been in favor of a much more integrated Europe for when it comes to tax and spending. And that relationship between Germany and France is extremely important for both countries. And coming together with France, as a month ago, the plan was launched with Chancellor Merkel and President Macron, that this was a very strong symbol of Germany's commitment to Europe. Let me also say that the plan is that this 500 billion that France and Germany propose will only happen once. It's not, the idea is not that it's a continuous process whereby every year the Commission borrows more money. That the idea is it is a one-off measure to deal with the pandemic. And as I say, it amounts to 5% of all of the government debt currently outstanding in the European Union. So it's not a massive amount of money. It's significant, but not massive. And I think that was part of German thinking. Your other question about the frugal four, this definitely changes the dynamic. Clearly, when Germany, France, Italy, and Spain, the big four countries in the Eurozone, the biggest four economies in the European Union, when those four big countries come together and want to do something, it becomes much more difficult for the smaller countries to block. Now, that's not to say that the smaller, the frugal four, will not seek concessions. They will, of course, seek assurances around how this fund works. But I think the momentum is so strong, once Germany was in favor, that there will certainly be some significant fund. Many questions, as I say, to be agreed. And a bigger question, will it make much difference? Will this fund really change the economic prospects of Europe? That's not certain. So a lot of uncertainty, but I do think something big, there will be agreement, and the frugal four will have to concede ground because they're in such a small minority.
I can't resist the temptation to ask you to follow on this, my prior question, and to ask you what is your take about, will the recovery fund have a significant impact in the recovery of the European Union, or it's too little too late?
Well, too late remains to be seen. I think, as I mentioned in the talk, one of the things to be decided is the time frame over which the money will be distributed. And if that happens over a long time frame, then it won't have much impact. But if it's front-loaded and it happens quickly, then it's more likely to have an effect in bringing about, or at least helping, recovery. So, you know, the question about the role of stimulus in economies is, of course, one that economists debate all the time. I'm not convinced that this is enough money to, even if it's quickly distributed, that it will be enough to offset the scale of the shock that we've had. It really is, this looks like the worst economic recession in 100 years. How that evolves and what governments can do to help recovery, I think remains to be seen. So, unfortunately, I'd love to be more certain about things, but again, a lot of uncertainty over how much this could help, even if it is agreed.
Thank you so much. I want to invite Ambassador Graça Lima back in the game and ask him to refresh our memory about one of the questions he asked at the very beginning about how this affect Brexit and the relationships between the United Kingdom and the European Union. Please, Ambassador, concisely, can you say it again while we wait for other questions to arrive?
Yeah, the questions were about Brexit, the kind of agreement that could be expected by both by the British side and by the European side in terms of a new normal in this relationship. Second, it would be about the prospects of having the European Union Mercosur agreement ratified in light of the new developments, if they have compounded to the already very difficult picture. And the third would be about the priority that European Union can realistically attribute to the strengthening of the multilateral trading system in a juncture where everyone is really more worried about its own recovery.
Okay.
Before you start, let's follow Jack the Ripper advice. Let's proceed bit by bit. So first, I would ask you to focus on the Brexit issue, because I have other questions here related to the two last ones posed by Graça Lima. So first focus Brexit, and then we can go on. Okay,
perfect. Let me say, I've always been more pessimistic than the average person, analyst about Brexit. And I think so far that's proved to be correct. The relationship between the United Kingdom and the EU has been very badly damaged by Brexit. Everything that's happened over the past 4 years has caused difficulty. It's been very time-consuming for everyone. In almost every way, this has been a bad experience, in my view, both for the European Union and for the UK. Looking forward, there is not much time left. Doing trade deals takes a long time, as you'll know, and there really is very little time until the end of the year. There's only 6 months before Britain leaves the European single market. As you know, Britain formally left the European Union at the end of January, but it remains de facto a member of the economic bloc. That will change at the end of the year. Britain has said just this week that it definitely will not prolong its de facto membership of the economic bloc, which means there's 6 months to arrange to agree a new future relationship. And that is just not a lot of time to do it. And there are also political aspects in the United Kingdom there's a considerable pressure, a group of people in the ruling Conservative Party who want a complete, hard, no-deal Brexit. And I very much fear that that is going to be the outcome, and that will cause further problems in relation between Europe and the EU. It'll cause particular problems for my country, Ireland, because we are very connected to the UK economically, and relations between the EU and the United Kingdom, I think, are going to go through a very difficult period, and that is not something that is good at a time when there are so many challenges with other countries in our region, and as the ambassador mentioned, in particular with the multilateral trading system. We need countries who support the multilateral trading system need to be united now and forceful in advocating measures to protect it. And Britain was always an important partner in the EU in doing that. So in Europe, we're all weakened by Brexit, and that is not a good thing to be happening, particularly at a time when so much is changing.
Now the second question is related to European Union Mercosur agreement, a pending agreement. And this is a question that was asked prior by the Greek Consul General in Brazil, Stylianos, oh my goodness, I will make a mistake, Howard Musiadis, and how the COVID-19 and I would add environmental issue is affecting the relationship between the European Union and Mercosur countries, especially Brazil. And we have seen motions approved in national parliaments in Austria and in the Netherlands against the approval of the agreement. What are the chances that at the end of the day this agreement will be approved by the European Parliament?
I have to say I'm also pessimistic about that. At best, I think it's going to be a long time before it could be agreed. It was always going to be difficult to get agreement amongst the European countries on the deal. As you said, there was significant opposition in many EU countries. And right now, with so much that's uncertain around the economic dimension of the pandemic, I think that's going to push it further down the list of priorities in Europe. So I think it's going to make it even less likely in the short term that it will be agreed.
Very good. So now we can go to the issue of multilateralism. And in this, I think we should see this in the perspective of the... Ambassador Ybáñez, please.
If I may very briefly on EU-Mercosur, and particularly...
You should, I would say.
Thank you very much, and especially because it was something that Ambassador Gracia Lima directed also to me in his first part. Of course, I do perfectly understand the concern that Dan has said, but I think also it's important to see that the EU-Mercosur agreement is really going to come, if we are able to move on this direction, in a moment that I would say the two blocks, Mercosur and European Union, will have really a need to bring good news, and particularly on the trade area. And I think this is going to open a possibility for the companies of the Mercosur, but also the companies of the European Union to move ahead and to have possibilities from the economic point of view. And I think that some of the concern you mentioned, the votes in the Austrian Parliament and in the Netherlands Parliament. In fact, if you look at it, the questions which are raised in this Parliament are not so much on the agreement itself, much more on I would say, the behavior of some countries, and very particularly the case of Brazil, when you look at the sustainability and the situation in the Amazon. And on the contrary, because I myself, when I had to go in front of the European Parliament when I was posted as ambassador of the European Union here to Brazil, I got a lot of questions from the member of the Parliament. But I would say that almost all the questions, they were not at all referred, I would say, to the possibilities that the agreement gives, but more the capabilities of the agreement really to ensure that countries like Brazil, but of course all the other members of Mercosur, will be complying with sustainability issues, particularly, for example, to the stay in the Paris Agreement on the climate change. So I think that, and I go back a little bit to the reflection of Dan that I like very much about how the EU project can have chances or not. At the end, in many of these things, leadership is essential. It really depends on how leaders present the situation. I've been working in EU institutions from the Spanish side, I would say, a lot of years, and something which always surprised, and I must say that I didn't like at all, it was that after a long discussion in Brussels, when all the points of view were taken into consideration and an agreement was reached, of course, which was not the best agreement for each of the members, many of the politicians coming back to their countries in front of the parliament say, well, yes, I did everything I could, but Brussels made wrong on this decision, not assuming that the leaders were the ones who were discussing in Brussels. So I really think that leadership in EU-Mercosur is going to make a difference. It will, of course, depend on how the leaders will be able to explain to the citizens and, of course, to the members of the parliament, which will have to vote the agreement. And I really think that if we miss this opportunity, and I'm speaking as EU, I would say as a whole, it will be really an important opportunity lost because we will not have many of that. And if, of course, the EU is not able to engage in the way that the countries of Mercosur want, others will appear. Let us think of China, the US, and others. So even with all the difficulties, I really think that the debate is an important one on the relation. It's of course important for the countries of Mercosur, but I would say that is even, because I'm European, even more important for the Europeans. If we lose this opportunity, I don't think we will have many others on this particular, I would say, strategic relation that we want to have to the countries of Latin America and particularly the countries of Mercosur. Sorry for the interruption, but I wanted to answer, particularly in respect of Ambassador Graça Lima.
No, very relevant comments. Dan, would you like to react to Ambassador Ybáñez's comments? If you allow me, after you react to his comments, I would like to listen to Ambassador Graça Lima's opinion on this subject, a subject which is so important to us, South Americans and Brazilians in particular.
Okay, good. So a couple of points on multilateralism and particularly economic multilateralism. The World Trade Organization is the centerpiece. It is the best example in the history of the world of effective global multilateralism, particularly its disputes resolution mechanisms. We all know that they are now in crisis because the United States has refused to appoint members to these bodies. So there's a great difficulty in the functioning of the disputes resolution mechanism at the World Trade Organization. As you, of course, know, the head of the World Organization, a Brazilian, has just resigned early. I think that's reflective of the difficulties that the World Trade Organization is having. And that institution is very important for the functioning of the global trading system, and it's certainly at risk. Let me make two other points. One is at the end of globalization. Many people are talking about the end of globalization. I don't look at it in that way. Globalization is not a on-off. It's not a binary. It's globalization is a spectrum. And there are a lot of forces in the world now pushing us away from a globalized world towards a more protectionist world. And a final point, I think one of the things that's doing that is a decline in the belief in free markets in Europe and the United States. I think the younger generation in particular is shifting to the left, doesn't see free markets as being beneficial, often sees the negative sides of free markets, which of course there are. But it seems the political direction of travel in the Western world is away from free trade. And that is an important driver, I think, in what's happening in terms of multilateralism and support for economic multilateralism. So certainly for those of us who support economic openness, globalization, Europeanization, these are worrying times, and the direction of the argument seems to be going against us.
From my viewpoint, this agreement, or what was agreed between the Commission and the Mercosur countries, is extremely important for its institutional gains, more than for its market access gains. I don't see much. If you look at the quotas that are still being imposed on animal protein, and on the side of Mercosur, the quotas for the automotive sector, this doesn't quite fit into the idea of respecting WTO provisions and moving forward, creating trade. This is a fact that cannot be mentioned. I could not fail to mention. But on the other hand, because of the obligations it imposes on Mercosur members, it can be quite important for the future of Mercosur itself. That's what I would call the institutional gains, and it would be a pity that what was agreed will eventually be rejected even by the European Council or the European Parliament. It's a start. It's not ideal. It could be very encouraging for the efforts that should be made in Brazil and other Mercosur countries to go ahead with liberalization. And I do believe that if the process is not hurt by considerations of a different nature, that I think that it would be a step in the right direction.
Dan, we are arriving approaching the final moments of our flight. We're about to land. I have one last question here, and I would ask you to add any final remark you would like to add to our conversation. And I'll do the same invitation to Ambassador Ignacio. The question is posed by the General Counsel of Luxembourg here in São Paulo, my dear friend Ian Ybáñez. And the question is the following. Will the Recovery Fund have put pressure on Hungary and Poland to be more compliant with European democratic values, or you wouldn't see any element of this kind embedded in the fund?
Great question. Very, very difficult question. My hunch, my feeling is that in the end, it won't, although I don't hold that view very strongly, because the rule of law issues in the European Union absolutely must be protected, and there must be a mechanism to ensure that everyone meets their commitments. Money is a very important, I don't want to say weapon, but it's a very important device in terms of ensuring that everyone sticks by the rules. If governments know they're going to miss out on significant amounts of money, that can change behavior. As an economist, I believe in incentives. So, to provide incentives and disincentives is an important mechanism. But my sense from the politics of it is that it won't end up being a significant factor, although I hope I'm wrong on that.
Very good. Ambassador Ignacio Ybáñez, señor, por favor.
Muchas gracias.
¿Quieres agregar algún comentario al final de nuestra conversación? Ahora, no en español, lamentablemente, pero en inglés.
In English. No, I will touch on the question, because I think it's a good question. Of course, we have, I would say, as a citizen, the same doubts that Dan has. But I would say, as part of the institutions, I think very clearly the European Commission wanted to have these on the text, and one of the elements of the recovery plan is clear that the recovery has to be based on EU values and fundamental rights. And they say, I quote, the recovery must be based on fundamental rights and full respect of the rule of law. And the communication goes a little bit more on that, recognizing that because of COVID, some of the governments will have had to adopt measures that in normal times will not be acceptable by any democracy. But of course, as we are going to go back to normality, we have respect these rules. So I think it's going to be an element, as you know, in the case of the country which was mentioned, there are other procedures already which have been launched inside the EU. We have to see. But I really think that the recovery, and I would say the crisis, has taught us some lessons, and that it is true that we need to have, I would say, measures to be able to control the contagion. But what we want, all of us, is to go to the normality of the country we were. And I think this is what makes the difference of the EU with other models. I will not mention which, but other models, perhaps from the economic point of view, in a very short and first reaction, they could be more efficient than the EU. But the good thing is that the EU, what they do is they do respecting these values. So I really think that we have to do our best, and this is the idea of the European Commission, that of course countries which will be acting against contravention of our rights will be of course not being able to benefit from these ideas of the recovery. So I think the idea is there, how we will be able, how the Council will be able to apply, and how we're going to be able in the future. I also have, like Dan, a question mark. But the intention is clearly that the principles matter, and these values have to be respected in the EU, and especially in a very in an emergency situation where we are going to do things that we were not doing in the past, especially from the financing point of view.
Dan, final consideration, the floor is yours.
Well, I always like to end on a positive note, and even in very difficult times like this, and there will be more difficult times in the short term for all of us, that to believe in human progress and the ability of countries and humanity to overcome problems is always something that gives some consolation in difficult times. And whether we find a vaccine to the coronavirus, or whether it's how we get out of the very difficult economic times we're going into now, I do retain optimism. I think we will we will come through this, and we'll overcome it.
Thank you so much for your thoughtful reflections on the crisis and how to get out of it. I think we have covered a lot of ground here. It's never enough. We always leave the table a little hungry still, but this is a good sign. I would like to thank you, Ambassador Ignacio Ybáñez, and the delegation of the European Union. I hope this is not the first joint venture between us, but it's the first joint venture on the digital digital form. We've been thinking about doing other events together. Judging by the first experience, I think we're going to be successful. So thank you so much. Thank you so much, Sabri and Ambassador Graça Lima, to share his thoughts with us today. Thank you, Consul General Barry, for all your support, unwavering support from the very beginning since you were here. You were here in Brazil. And then, once again, thank you so much for making the time to be with us. I hope we see each other in the near future, either through the screen or even better in person. I like the phrase, stay safe, stay sane. So, and I think that applies to all of us. Thank you so much. And for those who have participated in this event, asking questions and watching the debate. Thank you so much. Great pleasure. Bye-bye. Stay safe.
Thank you, Sergio. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye, folks.
Thank you.